Hi, welcome to the session on identifying students for English learner programming in the 2020-21 school year. My name is Michael Bowler, and I work in the Division of Equity and Opportunity at the Minnesota Department of Education. And again, we'll be looking at identification during this session. All right, so thank you so much for joining me for the session on identifying students for EL programming. One of the critical things I want staff to keep in mind as they think about identifying multilingual learners for EL programming, in particular in the 2021 school year, is the Minnesota's 10 Commitments to Equity. So take a moment and think about the equity commitments here that will be most meaningful to you and your team as your team goes about identifying students for EL status during the 2021 school year. Keeping in mind that students, staff, and families are being impacted greatly by the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll start out by talking just a bit about some definitions, the difference between formal English language proficiency screening on the one hand and provisional identification for temporary EL programming on the other. In either case, you are going to report this child as EL-yes in MARS for the 2021 school year if the results of your screening tool indicate that the student is eligible for EL programming, or that the child would benefit from temporary EL programming. So with formal screening, that tool does provide official results about EL status. It assesses all 4 domains, and for both of these are required in grades K through 12 and for early learners in state-approved voluntary pre-kindergarten programs, as well as early learners in School Readiness Plus programs. The big thing to keep in mind is that when you use a provisional identification tool, you will need to verify the child's EL status as soon as you are able to do so using a formal ELP screener. And then another important caveat is if you get a change in results, your student has been receiving temporary EL programming, when you go to verify the status, it turns out that the child actually scores proficient on the WIDA screener, on that formal screening tool. So then you'll need to work with your MARS coordinator, and that child's record will need to be retroactively changed to EL no for this school year. And the child will not take the access test. It would appear that this child was not in an EL program at all for this year because in essence, the provisional tool resulted in a case of misidentification. When we talk about formal English language proficiency screening, there are 4 tools. This is a change because typically you would be aware of the 3 tools, the WIDA screener, used primarily in grades 1 through 12, and then the kindergarten WAPT, a free screening tool, and then the kindergarten model, which can be purchased locally. These 3 screeners, the WIDA screener, the kindergarten WAPT, and the kindergarten model cannot be used remotely. A recent addition to this list of ELP screeners that can be used for formal identification but for this year only, just for the 2021 school year, is the Lost Links Online. It can be used remotely. It would need to be purchased locally, though we do understand that GEARS Act and ESSER funds could potentially be used for that purpose. This is the only formal screening option for 2021 that can be administered remotely. And I'll just mention that in March of 2021, WIDA will release the kindergarten WIDA screener. And starting in March, you'll be able to use that in Minnesota. So watch for more information about that and trainings about that and plan accordingly. Excuse me. So when we look at the other side and look at provisional identification for EL programming during this school year, there are 3 tools available. You'll be familiar with number 3 probably because this is something that was available in March of last year. But I'll start at the top. WIDA in this fall, actually in August and September, came out with what they're calling the WIDA Remote Screener. Again, not a formal ELP screening tool, but a temporary identification tool that's available for free in the WIDA Secure portal and is can be used with students in grades K through 12. The second tool is the Council of Great City Schools has a guide for assessing language proficiency during extended school closures. These are sample questionnaires that you can use. There's also an optional writing rubric. And to find this tool, you'll go to the Council of Great City Schools website, and under academics, you'll see resources and tools and go there for this tool. And then finally, the parent interview process is described in the document Identifying Students for English Learner Status During Distance Learning, and this is available on the MDEL education page. So again, you'll be working with your MARS coordinator to accurately report students and their EL status for this school year. And regardless of the tool you use to identify students for EL status, we would like you to go ahead and report those students in MARS. So if they qualify for EL programming, you will mark them as EL yes. And if they're not eligible for EL programming, they should be reported as EL no. And again, if a provisional tool is used to make that determination, then the student must take a formal ELP screener as soon as it is feasible to do so in your district or charter school. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if the ELP screening, the formal ELP screening, shows that the student is in fact proficient in English, then the MARS record will need to be retroactively changed to EL no for the 2021 school year. Parent notification is going to look very similar to what it has looked like in the past. However, there is some flexibility from the U.S. Department of Education. So during the school year, where we would typically be saying that you have 14 days to identify and identify students and notify parents, you have a little bit of flexibility now. Districts and charter schools must identify any student that enrolls in the middle of the school year within 30 calendar days, and then districts have an additional 14 calendar days to notify parents of EL programming. The parent notification letter is available in the parent notices section of Transact. And the main difference, if a student has been identified using a provisional tool, then that should be indicated on the letter. You won't have a proficiency level in the same way, so you won't have those scores to provide. And you'll want to indicate that the student was identified using a provisional tool, and that the student will need to take the formal ELP screener when it's possible to do so. So yeah, I want to provide an overview of some of the updates regarding identification for EL programming that are kind of new for this year, new since the fall. We do have two updated documents. The first is the 2021 Guide for Identifying Multilingual Learners for ELD during COVID. This was posted on September 14th and is a quick guide. It's a one-pager. It outlines the formal ELP screeners and provisional tools, includes a 5-step process for identifying students for EL programming. And one of the things to keep in mind about the parent interview protocol, and this is described in more detail in the more comprehensive guide that's on our website, the one dated, I believe, September 30th. Whereas in March, there wasn't clear guidance that these tools could be used with kindergartners. That's not the case for this year. So as I think most of you are aware by this point. So any of these tools, including the parent interview protocol, can be used with kindergartners and can also be used with students in state-approved voluntary pre-kindergarten and School Readiness Plus programs. Another update for you is that the WIDA remote screener and the tool that the Council of Great City Schools has provided, again, these are two new temporary identification options that can be used this year in grades K-12, and then again also in state-approved VPK and School Readiness Plus programs. Another new thing that you may be interested in is that the Lost Links online ELP screener has been added as a formal ELP screening option. That's for this year only during the COVID-19 pandemic. It is a tool that would need to be purchased locally, and you could look into having CARES Act or GEAR funds be being utilized for that purpose. Keep in mind that students identified for EL programming using any of the provisional tools should be reported in MARS based on the outcome of that identification tool. And then you'll need to have some kind of system for keeping track of those students that were identified temporarily so that you know you'll need to go back and verify their EL status when you are able to do so. And then finally, if you have questions about training, certification, and or proficiency criteria on the formal screeners, I recommend going to the Minnesota WIDA membership page. And each year we update the Minnesota Identification and Placement Guidance. A lot of details on those topics in that document. Okay, let's look at some frequently asked questions that we're getting about identifying multilingual learners for EL programming. Can in-person ELP screening be done if your district has a distance learning model during the 2021 school year? And we realize many of your districts have had to shift recently, maybe even this week, to distance learning or hybrid learning. Yes, this is a local decision. You may determine that ELP screening can be done in person as long as the following conditions can be met. So students, staff, and families will all need to follow the Minnesota Department of Health guidance for social distancing in youth and student programs. So at a high level, that includes health checks, social distancing, and masking. But of course, staff, students, and families in at-risk categories should not be encouraged to act inconsistently with public health recommendations or the advice of their medical providers. So even if you're doing some in-person screening, some families may not be comfortable with that. That may not work for some staff. And then finally, this guidance is subject to change. And so we do encourage you to keep an eye on the MDE COVID-19 page for ongoing updates. Can districts use provisional identification tools with kindergartners during this school year during the COVID-19 pandemic? And yes, as I mentioned earlier, and I can go into a little more detail about that. So for example, with the K1 WIDA remote tool, that's only going to look at speaking. However, with the Council of Great Cities Schools tool, those sample questionnaires, that can give you something more similar to what you would get with a formal screener, where you can get two different proficiency levels, either a student's at beginning or the student may be at an intermediate to advanced level. And then finally, with the parent interview protocol, you can use that with kindergartners. This is going to probably be the quickest, but also the least robust. It's just going to help you understand if the parents feel that the child may benefit from EL programming temporarily during COVID-19 for this school year. And there's more details about that in the Identifying Students for EL Status During Distance Learning document posted 9/30/2020. Can the WIDA screener be administered remotely? Again, no, none of the formal screeners that have been in place prior to this school year can be used remotely. Though again, the Last Links Online has been added as a formal ELP screening tool that districts and charter schools can purchase. For K-12, that would just be for this school year, but for early learning programs, for state-approved VPK and School Readiness Plus programs, the Last Links is one of the recommended approved ELP screeners. Is the WIDA remote screener a formal ELP screener? So the name has caused some confusion, and so I do refer to this as a temporary identification tool. So no, it's not a formal tool. Again, it is free and it is available in the WIDA Secure portal. And if you or your staff do not currently have access to the WIDA Secure portal, you'll work with your district assessment coordinator to get those permissions, or contact us if you're having trouble with that. What are the training requirements for the WIDA screener? So yeah, staff administering an approved ELP screener do need to complete the WIDA training sessions each year. If staff are scoring any portion of the screener locally, then they will need to get 80% or higher on the quizzes, and that's an annual process, and those are available again in the WIDA Secure portal. And again, for more details about this process, I recommend visiting Minnesota's WIDA membership page and viewing the Minnesota Identification and Placement Guide. We have talked about this, but want to make sure this is clear, so I'll break this down a little more. How should districts report students in MARS? So students identified as needing EL programming during this school year should be identified as EL Yes in MARS, and those identified as not needing EL programming should be identified as EL No in MARS. Again, the U.S. Department of Education requires that any student identified for temporary EL programming will need to take a formal ELP screener when it is possible to do so. And again, if formal ELP screening shows that the student actually is already proficient in English and that the provisional tool just didn't pick that up, that was a case of misidentification. The child's MARS record will need to be retroactively changed to EL No for 2020-21. Student will not take the access test, and there will be no record formally in MARS that the child did have EL status in EL programming. So I encourage making a note of that and why that happened in the child's cumulative file, so that to avoid any confusion that other staff may have moving forward. Can the access test be used to verify a student's EL status? The short answer would be no. You should. We do need to shy away from that. It would be a last resort. So districts are encouraged to verify EL status as quickly as possible using a formal ELP screener. But if it's not possible to do that before the access window, then that access test result would be a secondary way of verifying the child's EL status. This is something we've been waiting for confirmation from WIDA about, so we want to avoid this situation if possible, but we think that could be a possibility. If staff provide in-person ELP screening, how should they manage shared materials? So looking at the Minnesota Department of Health planning guide for schools for this year, of course, they say that sharing materials should be avoided. We know that may not be possible with ELP screening, so any shared materials should be disinfected before and after each use. And refer to pages 11 to 13 of that guide for more details about that, and the section is called Cleaning and Materials Handling. And I just really encourage you to work with your school nurse as you implement any of the public health guidelines in your district or charter school. What should staff do if the results of the provisional identification tool are inconclusive or not clear? So we're hoping this won't come up very often, though it potentially could. I think that could happen with the WIDA remote identification tool or with the Council of Great City Schools tool. These are just temporary tools. They're not going to give you comprehensive English language proficiency information. And so what I'd recommend, if it's still unclear, then I'd reach out to parents. I'd use the parent interview protocol described on the document identifying students for EL status during distance learning, dated 9/30/20. And that conversation with parents will allow you to make a definitive determination if EL programming is temporarily in the best interest of the child. Where can district staff find ongoing updates about EL programming for this school year? Again, your main site for that information will be the MDE COVID-19 updates page, though, and there's a section there, student instruction, and then you're going to look for multilingual learners. Though whenever we post information there, we're trying to also post it on the MDE EL education page. And here's some contact information for you, whether you have questions about programming, about questions for WIDA or DRC, or statewide testing, the MARS staff, or data and analytics. You can find that information right here. So thank you so much for your time. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And on the afternoon of Thursday, November 19th, we will have a question and answer session for any of the recorded sessions. So feel free to join us then. Thanks for your time.